Welcome on in, and this is By the Numbers episode 3, an episode that I've been waiting to put together and get out so long that I missed my date in March to release one a month. But I think the subject matter is very reasonable for why it had taken so long. We're here talking about the beginning, middle, and end of what will be known as the floppiest of flops when it comes to superhero franchises, the things that seem like it should have been a slam dunk, but what went wrong? That's right. Episode 3 of By the Numbers is all about the DCEU, looking at its highs and low points and trying to figure out why it's being rebooted and where it went wrong and how wrong did it go. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the DCEU. So just off the start, let's be clear. There'll be some biased talk when we talk about my personal feelings on these movies. And while I'm not going to try and make this about how the movies performed in terms of critic or audience responses, I try to focus about the numbers of the box office and how movies are able to make or lose money. There's definitely going to be some of that in here, so I'm going to put that up front. But the DCEU is such an involved, rich history, and when you're going through everything that has happened, you have to start at the very beginning, where I think everybody really was excited to see this new world be built together. And that is with Man of Steel. This movie, which for its time had a pretty significant budget of around $225 million, was directed by Zack Snyder, was the first superhero Superman film in a decent amount of time, and was coming off the hot success of Christopher Nolan in the Batman Dark Knight trilogy over at Warner Brothers. And while this movie had a very decent start, you can see here the worldwide gross made just about $670 million. My estimated profit numbers probably have it in theaters about $105 million, and it was able to start the DCU off pretty well with a profit of around $105 million. Which is, to start a franchise, it might not have been as big as a bomb as, say, Iron Man was for the MCU to light the match. Man of Steel definitely came in and performed in a pretty modestly good way and showed there was an audience for the fabled DC superheroes that were really only ever seen as Batman and Superman on the big screen, and all of the other heroes kind of got lost behind, whether it be cartoons or other areas. It never quite got the overall exposure as the Marvel comics at that time did. So we're seeing here off to the start a decently well start, and we're going to lead into the next big movie that gets released for the DCEU, and that is Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, or I like to call it Batman v Superman: My Mother's Name is Martha.
What does that mean? Why did you say that name?
Find him! Save Martha!
Now, this movie had a pretty similar budget, around $250 million, but you can see, bringing in Batman, having that promise of this big showdown, it was able to pick up a worldwide gross of around $875 million, bringing in almost $250 million in profit estimates, leaving the DCU just profiting at this time around $350 million. Now, it's safe to say, though, that by this time when this movie came out, we've already had the Avengers. This was coming out right before the Civil War movie with Captain America and Iron Man. Marvel was very much in their billion-dollar high $800-900 million streak. So when we see Batman v Superman, the first team-up movie really of an era for DC, these numbers came across kind of weak. And early on, the signs were there that this might not be the biggest hit of a franchise as we all thought it might be, but it still was able to keep eyes enough, make money enough, and whether people loved it or not, it was a financial success for DC, and they were able to pour some more money into different type of projects. But what came after Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice? Was it Wonder Woman? Not quite. Was it any of the other superheroes that they teased in the movie? No. Was it a group of people that had to remind you 1,000 times they're the bad guys?
We're bad guys. It's what we do.
Don't forget, we're the bad guys.
Yes. The first Suicide Squad movie came out, and it was actually another big hit. A little bit lower budget, around 185 million, led by Will Smith, Margot Robbie, Jared Leto, Viola Davis, Joel Kinnaman. This movie was able to bring worldwide around $750 million, which for a kind of nonsensical, a lot of these characters outside of Harley Quinn, not well-known movie, did pretty well. Now, the Joker was advertised, but wasn't in it as much as it was, and maybe that turned some people bad. The movie itself wasn't perfectly received. I know it wasn't one that I personally enjoyed, but it did bring up in about an estimated profit with the lower budget, making it around $286 million for DC. And you can see in their first three movies, just the profit of this universe was $640 million. Keep remembering that number because we're going to come back to it near the end of this video, and things are going well. It's not the highest highs as, say, the MCU, but the DCEU is having a lifeblood in there. And even if they were the bad guys, there's momentum happening all across DC. And it wasn't stopped next when we saw Wonder Woman come out, having a very modest $150 million budget. This was a very big theatrical, commercial, critical hit. Gal Gadot and Patty Jenkins took the world by storm and what was pretty much the first female-led superhero movie that we got. It got a worldwide gross of around $824 million, bringing in likely around $450 million of profits to Warner Brothers. And if you look at what the DC, profit to date, you're 4 movies in, and you've probably made about $1 billion for your franchise already. Things are going well for the DCEU. Wonder Woman made people believe critically that this is a future being held here for these movies. You had a wide range of audience members that was able to pick up a lot of the female demo where Marvel and a lot of comic book movies were struggling. Things were going well. But then we have our first roadblock and hiccup. And what was that roadblock or hiccup? Well, Justice League.
Shall we?
This movie has a $300 million budget, mainly because of the tragedy that happened to Zack Snyder and Joss Whedon coming in and kind of rewriting and redoing the movie. It had a just over-bloated budget, and even though you can say it made about the same as Man of Steel, $661.3 million, this likely lost them about 89, 90, maybe even over $100 million for the studio. Which, when you consider, a franchise that is having their first big team-up movie, their first movie with Flash, with Aquaman, with Cyborg, to have a movie like this now lose you money is a huge hiccup. And it definitely felt like a rush was trying to be made to where Marvel had, in a similar time frame, but with multiple more movies, built up their characters to lead into the Avengers. DC, besides Wonder Woman, took the approach of having their characters be introduced to Justice League, then eventually, leading into their solo movie. But this movie was not very well critically received. It did not have very good business, and what they were banking on with the Justice League was a Avengers-like billion-dollar movie, billion-dollar project, but ended up being one of their biggest early-on struggles of this era. A lot of people will point to this as the downfall of the DCEU. I'm not going to say that here. I think there's another clear point where the DCEU jumps off a cliff and goes down a very dark road. But you can definitely see here that the Justice League was not that team-up movie that you wanted to see. And from here on out, DC changed their approach in how they were making movies. We did not see really any other team-up movies going forward. Instead, focusing more on individual characters. And how did that go for them? Well, Next up, we get a little bit of Aquaman. This, like Wonder Woman, modestly budgeted at $160 movie, brought in the $1 billion plus that they were hoping they would get for Justice League. Huge profits are probably over $750 million and skyrocketing the DCEU profits to date. This was DC feeling like they found the formula and they committed to this formula long term in ways that could have helped the company, but probably also sank it. No pun intended, being that we're talking about a C movie. Now, this movie felt very original at the time. It definitely didn't have the controversy yet with Amber Heard and her character of Mira being involved in the film. And Arthur Curry and Jason Momoa was probably at the height of his popularity coming off Game of Thrones, being one of the more positive features in the Justice League. Definitely Aquaman was the highest point and the highlight of the DCU. If you're looking at the peak, if you're looking at the the crescendo point of the DCEU, this is where it got its best. They never ever were able to reach the same heights in terms of individual movie success. While the profit to date still will go up here as we see, this is the crown jewel of the DCEU financially by the numbers. And from here on out, the dark times kind of come. And they don't really come just yet because we have a decent Shazam film. It might not bring you the most money in the world, only looking at a worldwide gross around $367 million, but the budget wasn't that much, so they probably made about $100 million of profit. Their profit to date for this universe was almost $2 billion overall. And Shazam, while a success, probably taught a right and wrong message at the same time, which is right where you don't be afraid to do smaller budgets and more obscure type heroes and tell a good story. But that didn't follow through in the whole entire way through. And we'll see here as we move forward, budgets and other expenses went a little bit haywire and things kind of go down from here. Now, next up after Shazam was Birds of Prey and the fantabulous emancipation of one Harley Quinn. I'm just going to call it Birds of Prey from now on because nobody wants to say the last half of that. Again, a pretty modestly budgeted movie, about $85 million. This happened right before COVID started, so its worldwide gross of $205 million might have been a little bit more if COVID didn't take place, but still kind of break even. And this was the last kind of glimmer of hope. Now, February 7th, 2020 is a time period we all remember as pre-COVID. And Warner Brothers made some decisions coming through COVID that potentially changed the course of history for a lot of movies. And I personally think the DCU as a whole took a huge hit. And while Justice League will definitely be seen as one of the first fracture points financially for this universe, COVID coming in and boosting production costs, hurting the overall basic box office, and just not taking a step back and allowing yourselves to breathe and plan coming out of COVID sank the DCEU. What do I mean by that? Well, the next movie to come out in the DCEU was the sequel to the hit Wonder Woman 1984. This movie came out during Christmas of 2020. It was day and day on HBO Max. And even though some theaters were open during the holidays at the end of that year, the pandemic was still in full force and people weren't going out. And this $200 million movie only had a worldwide gross of about $170 million. And it took probably upwards of $300 million of hit in profits. So if a universe that was closing in on $2 billion of profit is now already down to $1.5 billion. And the movie wasn't well received by fans. It wasn't well received critically. And it kind of gave a distaste to the DCEU for a lot of people, feeling like we're going the wrong direction, kind of itching to have that team up movie, I think, in a lot of ways. But we're not doing that because we're going in on these were all movies that were kind of pre-planned pre-COVID, got pushed back a little bit and couldn't be stopped. And because COVID took place, the budgeted balloons, and because the box office changed, things went wrong. And you see it here with the Suicide Squad. This movie about the same budget as the first Suicide Squad movie, $185 million. But this, again, in theaters day and day as HBO Max in 2021, where the Omicron variant was still kind of taking place, and the theaters haven't really recovered yet. Only a worldwide gross of $170 million. You see, with Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, there's a lot of banking on her as a character and as an actress to bring in money after the first Suicide Squad movie. But it didn't happen for Birds of Prey. It didn't happen for the Suicide Squad. Even though this movie is pretty well reviewed by both critics and fans, it lost probably another $300 million for the franchise. Now, again, just 2 movies ago, it was pushing $2 billion of total profit. Now we're already down to $1.25 billion of profit, and things are not going well. And because so many of these movies were made and produced during COVID times, these budgets kept exploding higher and higher for characters that are a little bit lesser known, like Shazam. The reason why Shazam 1 worked is because it was only a $100 million budget. It wasn't crossing up into the $200 million amount. It was still in a time period where people were going more and more to the theaters. And unfortunately, after the Suicide Squad, The Rock's Black Adam, which somehow had a bigger budget, of almost $200 million theaters, and it didn't even make $400 million worldwide. Yes, this was a whole lot better than, say, the Suicide Squad, but this came out almost, I believe, a year after the Suicide Squad did, and the damage to the brand had kind of hurt. We were hearing about infightings between The Rock and DC heads. There was a lot of misinformation going around, and people were trying to control what was going to happen with DC. And Black Adam came in and lost the studio probably about $100 million or just under that in profits for them. And again, they're almost at the point where now with their profits from the very beginning, from Man of Steel, is almost all the way down now to $1 billion. We've almost lost a full $800 million of profits for this whole entire universe in just a flick of a snap. Thanos pun intended. Now, at this point, we end up getting James Gunn's announcement that he's going to take over DC and that it is going to be rebooted. And what damage did that have on the DCEU? Well, it made the next 3 movies feel like unimportant non-factors because they weren't going to be a part of a bigger story and they weren't going to continue on into something else. And that was seen very heavily through Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Now, this one, unlike Black Adam, had a mild budget of $125 million, but it wasn't well received critically. And with all the drama that happened during Black Adam and the changeover happening with the DC getting rebooted, nobody felt there was a need to go and see this movie. And it only grossed worldwide about its budget, $133 million. That means with all the cost of, advertising, with all the amount you actually get back from this, movie theaters and such, this movie probably lost them about $175 million in profits. And now, out of nowhere, the DCEU is a franchise that is under $1 billion in profits. Avengers Endgame had made more profits in itself than the DCU has made during its whole entire timeline, and it does not get better from here. Again, controversy has happened with the actor Ezra Miller, but that doesn't mean The Flash isn't going to get pushed aside or not put out. It gets put out, it gets given a lot of hype, and fans didn't respond to it. It did not do well critically. It did not do well audience-wise. It had a very large $200 million budget. A lot of reshoots took place because this movie was supposed to be a starting kind of point for the DCEU, kind of a rebranding point, but James Gunn was wiping everything clean. So this movie ended up being a big tank fest. With only $270 million worldwide gross, another $200+ million loss in profits, costing the company money happens. And a studio that not only pre-COVID was pushing almost $200 billion in profits to date is now lost $1 billion in just 3 years. It's absolutely amazing how quickly this went to shit. And it is a story that I think will be forever remembered. And when it comes to companies and franchises looking at stuff and figuring out when is the time to cut and how, what do you not want to do or what to do, the rise and fall and the dramatic fall of the DCU will be looked at for years and years to come, because when this fell, it crumbled and it fell in a blades of glory. Just again, using Marvel and Thanos. It's like you snapped, and within 3 years, half the profits you were able to put in the movies was gone, and over half. This was like almost 2/3, and we're not even done yet. There's one more DC movie left, and the reason why it took me so long to make this video because I wanted to wait until it was pretty much out of theaters. And that is there's two. I apologize. I forgot about Blue Beetle like the rest of us forgot about Blue Beetle. Even though I watched this and I thought it was an okay overall movie, and this had that $100 million budget that you saw with Shazam, it just was negative word of mouth with the DC. This was a character that we didn't know if they were or they weren't going to be a part of the DCEU. And in a world where superhero fatigue was definitely taking place, we lost another $100 million for DC with Blue Beetle, and maybe a character that should have came back and should have been pushed back. There's no reason why they could have just held on to this movie and released it later on after Aquaman as a starting point for a new DCEU. Instead, it gets lost in the old, and it costs the company over $100 million, and just again another loss. And finally, we'll talk about Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, the last ever DCEU film. And this film had a bigger budget, $205 million, hoping to capitalize off that billion-dollar franchise Aquaman. Maybe that this is so separate from anything rest of the DCEU. This is the last movie. Will it get a proper send-off? No, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom only is grossing around $430 to $450 million. It's not going to lose over $100 million like so many of the other movies have recently, but it's still losing Warner Brothers and DC money. And remember when I talked about the DCU after Suicide Squad having a profit more, today after, with their first three movies having DCEU profits over $600 million? Well, we can officially say, most likely, since that point, just in the theatrical runs, the DCEU has, with all the money they've lost with recent releases, is below the profit start point that they had after the Suicide Squad. My estimates have the DCEU as a profitability area of around $500 million. Now, overall, when you look at things, you have a franchise that was able to give yourselves $500 million of profit. That's not the worst thing in Hollywood. But let me bring up a chart to kind of show and illustrate how bad things have been and why we're getting reboots and why is everything being wiped clean for the most part from this DCU universe. It's pretty simple. Here in red, you see the gross profit of the DCEU. And you can see at the top with things like Shazam and Birds of Prey, where it peaked up around $1.8 billion, $1.9 billion. After three movies, they were $640 million. After four movies, they were over $1 billion in profit. You see the dip there with the Justice League, but then you see big rebounds with Aquaman and Shazam. And then you see the mountain descend. This looks like it's a Tour de France mountain map where you hit your peak and you just go straight down to almost where you started. And between Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, Black Adam, Shazam, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and Aquaman the Lost Kingdom, this franchise saw upwards of $1.3 billion in profit in costing the studio. That means these movies lost the studios over $1 billion in just the last 3 years, and it is why everything is being rebooted. It is why you're not going to probably see any of these characters show up anywhere in the new DCEU. It's why you're probably going to get James Gunn try to be as fresh as possible with whatever take he has on the new Superman movie that will eventually come out. This is a fascinating fall from grace for any franchise. This is as bad as it gets. And you can even see, though, yourself, between Man of Steel and Shazam, even Birds of Prey, you have the first half of the DCEU that was covered between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 movies within about 6 to 7 years. Well, then we got within 3 years, 7 movies, and they all lost money. And the DCEU will always be remembered for the end, where nothing went right, where drama was around every corner, and what looked like it should have been an easy slam dunk franchise to make and to hold and to profit from had turned into one of the most embarrassing things I think any Hollywood studio has put out post COVID. This is By the Numbers, episode 3, Why the DCEU is Being Rebooted. Thank you, like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next episode later on this month.